Hello there, my friend. I'm so excited to have you here on my channel. If this is your first time, please remember to subscribe and share this video with your friends or family. It means so much to me. Drop a comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from. I treasure every comment. Now, let's get started. At 29, Celia walked toward her future believing she had made the right decision. Graham, also 29, was calm, reliable, and lived his life by design. He never made her pulse race or her breath catch, but he offered something she had always needed: security. From an early age, Celia had been taught to value stability over passion. Her childhood recollections weren't filled with lullabies or fairy tales, but with late notices and muffled arguments. She remembered watching her mother hide past-due bills in the drawers beneath the sink, as if concealing them could delay the fallout. By the time she was 12, Celia was washing neighbors' clothes to buy notebooks for school. On her 18th birthday, she made herself a quiet vow. One day, she'd stop living in fear of going without. Graham felt like the embodiment of that promise. He came from wealth, had a respectable career, and lived according to a steady upward path. He was the kind of man who planned his weeks in advance, who liked knowing where he was going. With him, Celia felt like she had finally escaped the uncertainty of her youth. She told herself that love would come with time, that what they shared now was enough. But as their first year unfolded, their nights grew quieter, and weekends slipped into routine. Graham never faltered. He was loyal, conscientious, considerate. Still, his unwavering steadiness began to sap the vitality from her days. Life with him started to resemble a tastefully arranged display home. Immaculate, untouched, every moment rehearsed. Celia didn't notice when she began to retreat. She stopped finding his jokes funny. At night, she shifted away from him in bed. Mornings became brief exchanges and silent breakfasts. And Graham, to his credit, noticed. He tried. He really did. Surprise trips, flowers on random Tuesdays, new restaurants he hoped she'd like. Celia played the role. She smiled, posed for photos, responded with the right expressions. But inside, she was simply waiting for those efforts to be over. She found herself trapped in the very stillness she had once longed for. The calm that replaced chaos now felt like a cage. Everything in her life was steady, seamless, controlled. And the same heart that had once been driven by scarcity now felt suffocated by abundance. One night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling in silence. Graham slept peacefully beside her, his breathing even, one arm resting over his chest. She turned to look at him, studying the way the lamplight traced the lines of his face. There was no resentment in her gaze, no rage, no blame, only a deep, aching hollowness. He had never truly been more than a stranger she had mistaken for salvation. Her mind drifted to a long-forgotten night from her teenage years, when, after another screaming match between her parents, she had curled up on her aunt's sofa, eyes wide open until morning. That night, she had made a different kind of promise. She would never repeat the life she came from. And now, with everything she believed she had wanted, she was asking herself if any of it had ever been what she needed. The doubt crept in slowly, then all at once. Graham no longer felt like a partner. He was a system, a structure, a shield against the past. But not a companion, not someone who truly knew her. And she couldn't say these things out loud, because from the outside, their marriage was a picture of perfection. Graham was the kind of man others admired. Who was she to want more? Even Celia couldn't explain the absence she felt. She only knew that something fundamental was missing. Days blurred together. Graham left early for work. She kept the house running. But something inside her had started to change. She began to avoid the rituals they once shared, planning meals, chatting over tea, small touches on the couch. She needed space, though she couldn't say what for. Slowly, she began to build an invisible wall, not to keep him out, but to find room to breathe. Graham noticed, but didn't ask questions. He gave her what he thought she needed: room. And that quiet generosity, once comforting, now felt like silence growing louder. At a family lunch, her mother-in-law said something that lingered in Celia's mind long after. Smiling fondly, she remarked, "Graham has always been such a rock. He cares for Celia the way a father looks after his little girl." The words unsettled her. What once would have soothed her now felt like a constraint, a subtle erasure of her agency. Celia didn't want to be protected anymore. She wanted to exist on her own terms. She longed for unpredictability, for moments that broke from routine, for choices made from desire, not from fear. That week, staring at herself in the bathroom mirror, she found herself whispering a question she hadn't expected. "Do I even deserve this?" The mirror offered no answer, just the reflection of a woman who looked complete but felt vacant, a guest in her own life. And in that moment, Celia felt something stir inside her. Not a desire for change, but for rupture. Not for chaos, but for imperfection. A real, raw mistake. One that could crack the polished surface of her life. One that might wound her, but would remind her she could still feel. She couldn't yet envision what the consequences would be. But the desire had taken root. She couldn't have predicted the price she'd ultimately pay for the freedom she longed for so deeply. All she knew was the stifling weight of existing in a house that felt more like a carefully curated showroom than a home. Her journey toward escape didn't begin with a dramatic act. It started with something entirely routine. Just a quick trip to the store. That was all it was supposed to be. Celia had run out of a few ingredients for dinner and wanted to pick them up before Graham returned. It was one of those off-kilter days where nothing settled quite right. Her thoughts drifted as she wandered the aisles, barely registering the items she was tossing into her basket. Turning a corner too fast, she bumped into someone, a man balancing a large bag of rice. She muttered a quick apology. He responded with a relaxed smile, easy, magnetic, the kind that draws you in without trying too hard. She caught herself smiling back, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, already preparing to continue on her way. But then he made a comment about how absurdly overpriced the organic fruit was. She laughed, not because it was especially funny, but because it felt foreign and refreshing to laugh like that again, freely and without calculation. He introduced himself as Jasper. He was local, he said, and came here often. Celia only gave her first name, no details, no background. They stood there chatting in the middle of the cereal aisle longer than she would have imagined. 15 minutes, maybe more. The conversation felt oddly natural, unlike anything she was used to. There was none of Graham's quiet rigidity, none of the thinly veiled judgment she often sensed in his world. Jasper looked at her, not through her or past her, but at her, as though he truly wanted to understand the person behind the polite facade. As they parted ways, he said he'd enjoy continuing their talk sometime. She hesitated for just a moment, then handed him her number. He saved it as Celia from the market, giving her a playful wink before they walked off. On the drive home, she found herself unable to make sense of what had just occurred. It had been a simple exchange, really, and yet something in her had shifted. That night, her phone buzzed with a text. "Hope dinner came out all right. I make a killer lasagna if you ever need help." Celia chuckled quietly and typed out a reply, and from that moment on, a quiet rhythm began to form. In the days that followed, their messages became a regular part of her routine. At first, it was small talk. Gradually, the conversations deepened. Jasper asked about her favorite music, what authors moved her, how she spent her time when no one was watching. She found herself revealing things she'd never even shared with Graham. She never explicitly said she was married. Instead, she spoke in vague terms, of a complicated life, of a feeling of confinement she couldn't quite put into words. Jasper never pushed for clarity, but he seemed to understand all the same. One night, he sent a voice message. You deserve something lighter. Maybe that's what we're all missing, whatever it is that stirs us back to life." She played the message while lying beside Graham, who had already drifted off. A strange impulse made her slip out of bed and sit on the couch to respond. Something inside her had begun to thaw. A week later, they saw each other again. She told Graham she was visiting a friend and quietly slipped out. They chose a quiet cafe, one safely tucked away from familiar eyes. Jasper was already there when she arrived, holding a single red rose. Just before walking in, Celia removed her wedding ring and hid it in her makeup pouch, like she was folding away a version of herself. When he handed her the rose, she took it with a smile, like accepting a lovely little secret. The conversation between them flowed easily. He talked about a recent trip he'd taken, about a project he was passionate about dreams he hadn't yet given up on. Celia spoke of her days that bled into one another, the repetition that dulled everything. Jasper listened carefully, his attention like a balm. Every so often he'd touch her gently, her arm, her hand, and each time it sent a quiet current through her. Celia could feel the invisible line she was drawing near. But instead of retreating, she leaned forward. When he said goodbye with a kiss to her cheek, soft, slow, lingering just long enough, she closed her eyes and wished it would stretch on, if only to postpone the weight of everything else. After that day, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes a slow walk through the park, other times a hushed chat in his parked car. The intimacy grew in quiet increments. One day, he reached for her hand and held it without letting go. On another, she rested her head on his shoulder, grateful for the warmth. What began as a harmless detour became a refuge. Lies began to spill from her lips with unsettling ease. She was visiting family. She needed space. She was taking time for herself. Graham never questioned her. He remained the gentle, consistent man he'd always been, which somehow made it all more unbearable. A month passed before Jasper finally asked about her real life. This time, she didn't sidestep. She took a breath and told him the truth. She was married, lived with her husband, and that their relationship had grown hollow, not from conflict, but from absence, from quiet. Jasper sat with the revelation for a moment before answering. His voice was calm when he said, "That honestly surprises me. But I like the person I become when I'm with you. And I like who you are too, when you're with me. If they were going to keep seeing each other, it would be by choice, mutual, deliberate, uncoerced." That understanding settled something in Celia. She had braced for disapproval, but instead found herself received with warmth. And in that space, she allowed herself to release even more. Their meetings gradually transformed. Kisses no longer felt new, hugs stretched beyond the necessary, fingers skimmed over skin with intent. Celia began to dress with Jasper in her thoughts. She became more selective with what she wore, added a little extra color to her cheeks, applied perfume with care before heading out. She came back home with a racing heart and a knot in her stomach. Part of it was shame, but the rest was exhilaration. And it was that sense of being untethered that clung to her like a trap disguised as liberation. She had carved out something separate from her everyday life, a quiet world where she was noticed, desired, awakened. Every time Jasper looked at her with that unflinching, curious stare, she felt reassured that she was exactly where she needed to be. Her phone became a kind of longing made visible. Texts arrived at daybreak, after dinners, as night settled in. Sometimes, in the stillness of midnight, he would write to say he'd dreamed about her. One night, she stirred awake to find a message. "If I could, I'd be beside you now." She thought of replying, but simply gazed at the words, a faint smile playing at her lips. Slowly, without realizing it, she began wishing this secret version of her life were the real one. What began as a quiet temptation quickly transformed into a second life, one Celia began to yearn for more than anything else. Time with Jasper became her week's secret highlight. She started her days plotting their next encounter. She invented reasons to be out, shuffled her obligations, bent her calendar around him. She'd leave the house in one outfit, change into another in her car. She fixed her makeup in the rear view, prepared for every detail like someone love-struck. With each stolen moment they shared, the world seemed to flood back with color, even if it came at the expense of the life she'd built with Graham. Jasper was impulsive, assertive, full of opinions and emotion. He laughed with abandon, complimented her thoughts, her looks, her scent. When she was near him, the rest of her life vanished. Their kisses grew more urgent, their touches less hesitant. It wasn't just escape anymore. This wasn't a fling. It had the shape and weight of a true relationship, only kept in the dark. On days they couldn't meet, they texted into the early hours. Sometimes she'd hide in the bathroom just to hear his voice for a fleeting moment. Her heart leapt each time his name lit her screen. She began sleeping with her phone silent and face down, afraid of a message arriving at the wrong time. At home, Graham tried to piece together what remained. He brought flowers, booked short trips, picked out bottles of wine for them to share. Celia smiled, responded when she had to, but inside, she'd already left. She avoided closeness, said she was tired, claimed she needed time to herself. Graham noticed something had changed, though he couldn't prove it. He asked gently if anything was bothering her, made efforts to talk, suggested they reconnect. Celia brushed it aside, steered things to safer topics. When he mentioned therapy, she nodded in agreement, but never acted on it. Things unraveled faster after Jasper lost his apartment. A cut in his income and rising debts meant moving back in with his parents. Meeting in private became difficult. Celia could no longer go to him, and Jasper, growing restless, began pressing harder. He wanted more from her, more time, more presence, more risk. And then Celia crossed a line she couldn't erase. With Graham away on business, she let Jasper into the home they shared. It felt like stepping over an invisible boundary. Nervous but intoxicated by the thrill, she watched him take in the house. He admired the decor, touched her things gently, as though trying to leave his imprint on her ordinary world. They ended up in the bed she shared with Graham, breathless and laughing beneath the covers. Later, as they got dressed, Jasper made a dig about Graham, called him the company man of the month. Celia laughed. She said Graham was clueless, that he'd never see the truth. They chuckled together, as though ridiculing a figure neither of them took seriously. Afterward, Celia returned to her usual life as if nothing had shifted. Her confidence bloomed. The guilt that once haunted her now only murmured. She lied with ease. She began to believe Graham would never uncover any of it. But Jasper became more insistent. He wanted something solid, lasting, not scraps. Celia, torn between the safety she knew and the wildness she craved, told herself she could juggle both. But truth had already started to move beneath the surface. What came next wouldn't be a quiet conversation, nor a gentle revelation. It would be the start of everything falling apart. She never imagined things would unravel like this. It was just before 8 p.m. when Celia heard the familiar creak of the front door. Graham stepped inside, looking as composed as ever, like it had been just another ordinary day at work. When she asked him, offhandedly, how his day had gone, his response came calmly, but with an edge she didn't recognize. "We need to talk." His voice carried a weight she couldn't place, and it unsettled her. Celia tried to keep her expression neutral, but his piercing stare made that impossible. He motioned to the couch and told her to sit. Without elaborating, he pulled out his phone, opened an app, scrolled to a file, and pressed play. Moments later, her own voice echoed through the room. It was her, laughing, unmistakably, with Jasper. She heard herself belittle Graham, mocking his obliviousness and remarking on how easily he'd been misled. Then came Jasper's voice, sneering, calling Graham a fool who would never catch on. The two of them laughed at the absurdity of it all, treating it like a private joke. Celia sat motionless, horror setting in. Her face lost all color. What had once felt like control now dissolved into dread. She lunged toward the phone, but Graham held it just out of reach. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse or shout. He simply watched her with a quiet, unreadable calm. When the recording ended, he looked at her directly and said, "Get your things. You're leaving tonight." Celia tried to speak, to explain, to beg, but he lifted a hand to stop her. That was the moment the reality of it hit her. What she hadn't yet realized was that this confrontation had been weeks in the making. Despite his calm nature, Graham had sensed something long before. The half-baked excuses, the distracted looks, the unfamiliar cologne that lingered on her clothes, the sudden phone hang-ups, the subtle shifts in her schedule, the overly careful attempts to act normal. He hadn't been naive, just quietly observant. He had started connecting the dots, silently. He bought 2 small recording devices and hid them discreetly, one in their bedroom, the other in the living room. He programmed them for extended recordings and waited. Eventually, the truth revealed itself. He listened, every laugh, every insult. Then, without hesitation, he copied the audio files and forwarded them to Celia's parents. The message was brief and direct. "Listen to this before asking me for anything further." For years, her parents had leaned on Graham. He paid their rent, kept their insurance active, covered emergencies without question. He was the backbone of their financial security. With one message, that support began to vanish. And now, back in the moment. Celia sat in tears, saying she was lost, that her time with Jasper had been a mistake. She begged for forgiveness, pleaded to rebuild what they had, promised change. She talked about feeling stuck, emotionally drained, confused. But her words were frantic, more a grasp for control than a genuine apology. Graham said nothing. He stood, walked quietly down the hallway and opened the bedroom door. "Be gone by morning," he said flatly. "I'll spend the night at my brother's." When she tried to grab his arm, one last plea for closeness, he stepped away. No shouting, no anger, just the empty calm of someone who had already let go. By morning, Celia had packed 2 suitcases. She avoided looking around, knowing each wall, each object, carried echoes of a man who had loved her deeply, but had never truly been loved in return. She ordered a car and headed to her parents' house. When she arrived, her mother opened the door wearing a look that held disbelief, sorrow, and restrained anger. Her father didn't even come out of his room. And right then, Celia understood. Everything had changed. She didn't fully grasp how far the consequences would reach, but she already knew one thing. This was her doing. Graham came from a family whose name carried weight, influence. His upbringing had been shaped by power, by connections, figures in boardrooms, executives who owed him and his father favors. He never flaunted it, but when it mattered, he moved with precision. Once word of Celia's betrayal began to circulate, Graham placed 2 quiet but purposeful calls. The first was to someone in Jasper's company's HR team. The second, to an executive at a regional retailer that subcontracted Jasper's services. Within days, Jasper's name was quietly added to an internal list. Nothing formal, just enough to matter. And when Graham called him and said, "You won't be working here again," it wasn't a warning. It was a conclusion. Jasper tried to dismiss it, accused Graham of overreacting, said it didn't have to go that far. But the following days spoke louder than any of his protests. His contracts were pulled. The phone stopped ringing. Former associates ghosted him. Some wouldn't return his messages. Others actively avoided him in public. Interviews dried up. Employers gave vague explanations. "The role's been filled," or "We're pursuing other profiles." Jasper figured it out quickly. The signal had been sent, and Graham hadn't bothered to disguise it. Every move he made was calculated, Cold, exact, merciless. Before long, Jasper's name became synonymous with failure. With his reputation in shambles and no one left to turn to, he gathered the few belongings he still had and slipped out of the city without a trace. No messages left behind, no goodbye to Celia, no explanations. He didn't just leave, he escaped, as though unable to face the wreckage he'd caused. Celia only heard about his departure through a passing remark. Someone mentioned offhandedly that Jasper had been let go and had disappeared with no known destination. She didn't react outwardly, but the words struck her like a blow. She'd thought, naively maybe, that he would reach out, that he'd say something, offer some closure. He never did, and the silence cut deeper than she expected. Until that moment, she'd clung to the faint idea that their time together might have meant something real. His quiet exit crushed what was left of that belief. Alone and emotionally exhausted, Celia left her parents' house after weeks of suffocating strain. Her mother didn't hesitate to remind her, again and again, that she'd thrown away the family's last chance at security. Her father barely acknowledged she was there. With Graham's financial help gone, reality came crashing in. Overdue bills, non-stop calls from debt collectors, and no safety net. She scraped together enough to afford a tiny studio apartment. Sparse, uncomfortable, but hers. A fragile new beginning, draped in regret. She found a job at a local stationery store. The days melted into one another as she served customers, organized shelves, and kept inventory. Each morning she walked there slowly, as if retracing the path to where things had gone wrong. The designer clothes were long gone, replaced by plain essentials. Her once styled hair now tied back without care. Makeup became an afterthought, reserved for events that never came. She often avoided mirrors, not out of pride, but from dread, afraid to look too closely at the person she'd become. One quiet afternoon, while straightening the counter, the shop's entrance bell chimed. Celia looked up. A woman entered, composed and poised, wearing glasses and carrying a slim folder. At first, she seemed like just another customer, until the familiarity hit. Celia stiffened. It was Samantha, Graham's sister. Their gazes met. Samantha recognized her at once. No surprise in her expression, just the same composed reserve she'd always carried. She approached the counter and placed a few items down. Celia, unsure how to react, began scanning them in silence, her hands slightly trembling. The air between them grew heavy, loaded with everything left unsaid. Samantha handed over her card, paid, then paused. "He's doing fine, but he's different now," she said, before turning to leave. Celia didn't move. She hadn't been braced for this moment, or for those particular words. They lingered in the space between them, impossible to interpret clearly. A dig? An update? Something more? Before she could think better of it, the question slipped out. "Does he hate me?" Samantha hesitated. Then, locking eyes with her, she replied, "He says he's forgiven you, but forgiving someone doesn't mean they get to stay in your life." The words hit with quiet force. There was no spite in them, just a blunt truth delivered with clarity. Celia nodded faintly. Without another word, Samantha left. Celia turned back to her work, serving the next customer on autopilot, her thoughts miles away. When the store finally emptied, she retreated to the back room, slid to the floor, and leaned against the cool wall. The tears came, softly this time. But they were different now, not the desperate sobs of before. These were gentler, tinged with understanding. In that still moment, a realization settled over her. The forgiveness she'd feared would never come had already been given. And somehow, that knowledge meant more than anything else ever could. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel.